Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. This is the 5th session of this fall's Education Policy Colloquium series, sponsored by the Program on Education Policy and Governance, or PEPG. My name is Jim Pizer. I'm an academic visitor here at the Kennedy School, and it's an honor to be hosting this session, as well as all the others, under the leadership of Dr. Paul Peterson, as well as Marty West. And as you know, we meet here most Thursdays during the school year here at Taubman. And our next session is on November 13th, so in 2 weeks, not next week, but in 2 weeks, and we'll be hearing from Michelle Rhee and George Parker, who together negotiated a landmark collective bargaining agreement that put in place a merit pay system along with other reforms, especially teacher-related, to improve the quality of teaching in Washington, D.C., the D.C. public school system. So I hope you'll be able to join us for that session. Today's session is also a story about an innovative urban school district, but on the other side of the country, specifically Seattle, and a 2007 Supreme Court case that overturned the district's voluntary desegregation plan on a split 5-4 decision. Our speakers are Joe Olchefske, who was the CFO and then superintendent of the Seattle Public Schools from 1995 to 2003, and is also an academic visitor here at Kennedy School and a visiting adjunct lecturer. Did I get that right? At the Harvard Graduate School of Education down the street. He is joined by Thiru Vignarajah, the former Deputy Attorney General of Maryland, who clerked for Justice Stephen Breyer at the time of the Seattle case. Importantly, for purposes of today's discussion, Justice Breyer wrote a searing dissent in that case and later wrote a book entitled Breaking the Promise of Brown, which not coincidentally is the title of today's presentation. Both of our speakers have much longer resumes that are quite impressive. You'll have to trust me on that because it would take too long for me to go over them in any detail, even in a superficial way, so I'm not even going to try. After their comments, we should have plenty of time for questions and answers and discussion, and we'll give priority to folks in the room. There may be some folks online. If there are comments or questions that they have, please enter them into the chat, and we'll try to incorporate that into the discussion. The session is going out over Zoom, but it's also being recorded and will be posted on the PEPG website shortly thereafter today. So in effect, we're all on the record, so keep that in mind. And with that, it's my pleasure to turn the program over to Joe and Thiru.
Great. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Professor Peterson. It's great to be with all of you today. Let's see.
Oh, do you have a clicker?
Yeah.
I don't know if you or maybe Michael's in charge.
Great. So this is our overview of what we're going to talk about today. Jim has already done the heavy lift of welcome and introductions, and Thiru is going to walk you through just a brief primer, a brief overview of the history of desegregation cases, which are the cases that I inherited in leading Seattle Public Schools. Then I'll talk a little bit, get you on the ground, get you under the covers, get you under the hood, whatever idiom you'd like, about Seattle schools and our diversity plan and its effect in the city. And then Thiru will come back and talk about the Supreme Court case that eventually wended its way from Seattle through a series of intermediate steps and eventually got to the Supreme Court. We'll give a lot of time for discussion and Q&A. Okay. And here is the very distinguished resumes that Jim got. And most importantly, both of us have at least some Harvard bona fides, so we're not interlopers here. Okay.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you so much. It's always a privilege to get a chance to talk about an incredibly important subject. Perhaps the worst kept secret in America is that our public schools remain stubbornly segregated by race. It has been true now for longer than it has not been true. When Brown versus Board of Education was pronounced in a unanimous decision by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1954, many expected that things would change. In 1955, the Supreme Court said it again, that we would desegregate our public schools with all deliberate speed. And yet that first period of time was not the golden age of integration. It was anything but. The most stirring example of this took place in Little Rock, Arkansas, where Governor Orville Faubus blocked the schoolhouse doors to Little Rock Central High School and used the state militia to do so. 9 school children who would go on to be known as the Little Rock Nine were barred from delivering on the promise of Brown versus Board of Education from just a couple of years ago by the governor of that state. It took an extraordinary act by President Eisenhower, who nationalized the local militia and dispatched the 101st Airborne Division to Little Rock, who literally held the hands of the children who would go on to desegregate Little Rock Central High School. What happened there in the most conspicuous ways was happening in many places in the country where a period of non-compliance with a Supreme Court decision was the norm. Ultimately, the Supreme Court, through repeated pronouncements, would usher in a period where jurisdictions started to bend. There were 3 decisions, Swan, Green, and Keyes in the late 60s and early 70s that marked a turning point where the Supreme Court upheld federal court orders that demanded that school districts eliminate segregation root and branch. And one by one, they did. And these cases empowered the Office of Civil Rights within the Department of Justice to go across the country and compel integration to happen. That period, not long, the 6 years from 1968 to 1974, was the surge in integration in places that had resisted to date. That unfortunately came to an end most conspicuously in Milliken versus Bradley. Because in response to school districts that were finally honoring the commitments that Brad had put forward, people reacted, people moved, and the phenomenon of white flight started taking place all across the country. And to that phenomenon, school districts responded and federal courts responded, which led to an extraordinary controversy in Detroit, Michigan, where a federal court ordered that in order to satisfy the demands of Brown versus Board of Education, that the busing policy that would come into place would require inter-district busing, that the white flight that had happened in Detroit, where many white families moved to the suburbs, you couldn't have integrated schools if there were no white families to integrate. So they proposed and ultimately upheld at the district court level a policy where there would be busing from the suburbs of Detroit into the city of Detroit. That went to the U.S. Supreme Court in Milliken versus Bradley. And what had happened in the just months before is that President Nixon had now appointed 2 new justices to the Supreme Court. And what had been a majority the other way was now a 5-4 majority, where Justice Thurgood Marshall, who had argued Brown versus Board of Education, was now the leading dissent. In Milliken versus Bradley, the Supreme Court struck down a policy that involved busing across county city lines, and what was considered the best hope of counteracting the effects of white flight was brought to a halt. Justice Marshall worried deeply about the effects of this, and he unfortunately was proven right. In the years after that, integration slowed conspicuously to the point by 1988 was the very peak of integration in America's public schools. And that year was the culmination of a series of decisions that would go into the Supreme Court in the 90s, where the Office of Civil Rights of Republican president would go around the country declaring the status of jurisdictions to be unitary. In other words, that they had come far enough, that the consent decrees and federal decrees that had been placed could be lifted because integration had come far enough. That was the peak of integration in America, 1988. That was the most integrated America's public schools have been. And in every decade since, things have gotten worse to the point that by the time that Mr. Olchefske was trying to correct things in Seattle and other superintendents were doing it in other jurisdictions, America's public schools were more segregated than at any point since 1968. It had gone back so quickly in the years after 1988. That is the history that people like Joe inherited, where they were still trying to deliver on the commitment of diversity, still trying to deliver on the promise of Brown, but now with a series of legal impediments in place.
Okay, a little background on me. I joined the Seattle schools as the chief financial officer in 1995. The student assignment department reported to me. And the district had just hired the first of the non-traditional superintendents. And he clearly had an agenda of significant change. And because I was appointed with him by him, that was my agenda as well. And so from a student assignment standpoint, we wanted to move away from a desegregation plan to more of a choice-based plan that had significant commitment to diversity. That was our goal. And tragically, the superintendent passed away in office, and I had authored student assignment plan, was the lead author of the student assignment plan. He passed away. The board asked me to be superintendent. So I served for 5 years, really managing this plan that I had drafted in my previous role. And so I'm going to give you some background on that. I want to give you a note about race in Seattle. Everything Thiru said is built on an assumption that race is a black-white phenomenon. There are black kids and there are white kids, period. And maybe in Detroit and maybe in the South, that was true. It was not even close to true in Seattle. It's not true today. It wasn't true in 1995. Seattle, there's a few other cities that sort of fit this profile. You know, Oakland comes to mind immediately. Maybe Minneapolis comes to mind immediately. This polyglot racial composition of the city. Seattle schools, when I was superintendent, was 40% white, 25% black, 25% Asian, 10% Latino, and a meaningful 3 or 4% Native American. So use whatever idiom you like, crazy quill, polyglot, you know, but certainly it's not a black-white phenomenon like the prior 50 years of legal work had defined it as. And for the purpose of today's conversation, you know, we had to live within that framework. So for us, that meant white, non-white. So when I talk today, I'll talk about white, non-white. I'll talk about white minority. I'll talk about majority minority. I'll talk about white kids, kids of color. In a Seattle context, those are all synonymous terms. Okay, but it is an important distinction to make because in Seattle, we had 5th generation African Americans that had lived in Seattle, and we had recently arriving Oromo immigrants, and we considered them both black. We had some of the wealthiest people in the city were of Asian descent, the tech boom of Seattle, and we had Samoan and Tongan students who were some of the most violent students we had in the district, and we considered them both Asian. We had white students like my daughter. My daughter was a student, a kindergartner when I became superintendent. But we also had recent refugees from the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union, a lawless society that had significant criminal activity in our city, and we considered them both white. So how you check the box, sure, it's white, non-white. Let's just, behind those numbers is a very polyglot community that doesn't lend itself to the simple duality that's embedded in Thiru's comments. Okay, so let me give you just a quick primer on the demography and the geography of Seattle. This is Seattle. That body of water, the blue is the confines of the city. The school district is coterminous with the city. The body of water to the right, that's Lake Washington. Okay, so that's a lake. The body of water to the left is Puget Sound that goes out to the Pacific Ocean. Where it says Seattle there, that's downtown. Okay, so that's our orientation here. From a school district standpoint, we could divide the city into 3 areas. North, richer, whiter, more, fewer immigrants, and excess school capacity, meaning there were more seats in the schools that were there than there are kids resident in those neighborhoods. Okay. South is the mirror image of that. Poorer, less white, more immigrants, and deficit school capacity, meaning there are more kids there resident in that neighborhood than there are seats available in the schools to serve them. And then this third area here, west, is in many ways could be a district unto itself. It's sort of a self-contained district. It's about right-sized. It's mixed race, mixed income. If you were on the west side of the hill there, you got great views of Puget Sound, so that's where the rich people lived. If you lived on the right side of that hill, the east side of that hill, you looked over the Boeing plant, so the poor people lived there. All right, but in toto, it was sort of a right-sized sort of place. So before 1997, we absolutely had a plan consistent with everything Thiru just said. It was a desegregation plan. We called it a desegregation plan. That was its core objective. And in simplest terms, the idea was we were going to move a lot of minority kids from the south end of the city to the north end of the city. And we're going to move a bunch of white kids from the north end to the south end. That was the premise, and magically, poof, the schools would be integrated. Well, I describe it that we were good at half this plan. We were really good at moving the minority kids north. We were really bad at moving the white kids south. The white parents had an incredible ability to game the system. Check the incorrect box on their form. Cite an address for where they said they were living in order to get into the school they wanted to get into. And so for every one white kid that we bused from the north side to the south side, we bused 10 kids of color. So this was not a minor differential. It was a 10-to-1 ratio. Okay. Nobody liked this plan. We were complying. We were proudly complying. But the minority parents didn't like their kids taking hour and a half bus rides each way. Right? So the plan we developed was a choice-based plan. I will also say I would call it a diversity plan as opposed to a desegregation plan. Its overarching goal was to maximize parent satisfaction, get parents to feel good about the school choice they make for their kid. That was clearly our goal. Premise: any kid can choose any school. To say it a different way, schools are competing for enrollment. A radical premise, I got to tell you, in 1997. Not so much today with the rise of charters and others, but in 1997, that was a radical premise. And the fact is that parents don't choose schools in nice, neat bunches that exactly fit the number of seats that are available. So we'd have schools that had 300 seats available for an entering freshman class and 400 students wanted them. Well, not all of them were going to get it. We were going to say no to 100 of them. And so we had a system of tiebreakers to break the tie about which kids got a yes and which kids got a no. Okay. We knew, well, let me just go back. We knew this was going to dramatically change the demographic profile of every school in the district. We knew that. That was not lost on us whatsoever. We were working on the presumption that a lot of the South End kids were going to choose to go to South End schools. We didn't know how many, we didn't know which, we didn't know how quickly. There were those that argued that they liked the North End schools. They liked the hour bus ride. So, you're not going to get a big move. We didn't know, until parents chose, we didn't know. So we did this. We didn't do this in isolation. Sure, we went to an open choice plan. Any student can choose any school. But we knew then from an academic standpoint, from a learning need standpoint, schools were going to be dramatically different than one another. There was going to be concentrations of high need kids in some schools, concentration of low need kids in another. And we didn't know how they were going to arrive. So from a funding standpoint, we developed weighted student formula, which is sometimes it's called backpack funding. Student-based budgeting is another term for it. But it's basically money attached to kids. And as a student chose, that money would follow them to the school they were enrolled. Importantly, we weighted the funding. So different kids had different amounts of money attached to them. I mean, my daughter was a kindergartner when I became superintendent. I knew very well there was $2,500 attached to her. Her school had a severe special ed program in it. I also knew right down the hall from where my daughter was going to school, there was a kid with $25,000 attached to him. So these weren't minor weightings. These were significant weightings of students. And the funding moved with the kid as the kid chose. Okay? We also realized we had to change staff and our way we manage staff. We changed our union contract to do away with bumping rights, which meant a senior teacher could bump a junior teacher out of a school. Right? So a teacher could move to a school that they wanted to go to. And we said, the school needs to be able to choose what teachers are. Second, under state law, I had the unilateral authority to both appoint principals, but also assign principals. Unappealable, you couldn't even appeal to the school board. So I made a conscious decision that I wanted to, as much as kids were moving from north to south, we needed to move talent from north to south. And so historically, the Lifetime Achievement Award for a good principal was to get a cream puff school in the north end of the city. I said, no, we're going to move our best principals to our highest need schools. And so over my 5-year term, this was very central to my objective, was to move principals and populate them in the south end. And so the premise would be, as students move, they arrive at schools with the best principals and the most resources. And that was the sort of underlying theory of change, if you will. Well, what was the impact of all this? Because it played out in real time, basically from 97 to 02, 03. Well, in the North, I call it the politics of scarcity. Scarcity of kids, scarcity of resources, and scarcity of student need. Those schools did empty out. Those kids of color from the South End chose away from North End schools. Quickly. Maybe if a student was an entering 5th grader, they would want to stay for the last year. But if you were an entering 4th grader, you wanted to be close to home. And so those schools emptied out. There was clear risk of closing those schools. And those schools got really good at recruiting new students. The South is the reverse. It's the politics of abundance. Abundance of kids, abundance of resources, and abundance of student need. If we had student-teacher ratios in the South End, 18-1, 19-1, the North End, it'd be 26-1, 27-1. I could defend that as a superintendent, given the academic profile of the students in those schools. And they were getting the best principals. And one of the things I know about good principals is they're talent magnets unto themselves. I had control over principal appointments. I did not have control over teacher appointments. But if you were a teacher and your favorite principal just got an assignment in the South End and you're only going to have 17-to-1 student teacher ratio, you kind of like that. So we could get a migration of teaching talent in that same way, where historically, that's where all the rookies went. The rookie principals, the rookie teachers. And, my perfect in improving West Seattle, it was less disruptive to them, but clearly this created a dynamic, a disequilibrium there. And for me as a leader, I could focus on performance improvement within that, because they still had to compete to enroll kids in their school. Okay, so that's the dynamic that we released. And it played out significantly. It was, this was not in the cover of Night. This was well known, covered on the front page of the paper for 5-7 years. Tiebreakers. So Ballard High School has 300 seats available at freshman. Very popular school, 400 kids want them. It was effectively my job, or more the job of the school district, to figure out the 300 that got in and the 100 that didn't. That was also true at an elementary school, where you've got 50 seats for kindergarten and 75 kids want them. You have to choose. For elementary and middle, the tiebreaker was siblings of an existing kid in the school got first. So if you were at Montlake Elementary and 75 kids wanted the seats and we had 50 seats, the first 20 kids that were siblings of first and second and third graders got the seat. Then if you were in the Montlake neighborhood, you got in next, right? That might have been another 20 seats. So now you had 10 seats left. 50 seats available, you only had 10 seats remaining, and 35 kids wanted them. So how do you do that? Well, we said we value diversity. If you are a white-dominated school, I think the number was 75% of one race. The opposite racial group got in next. So if you were a white-dominated school, kids of color got next. If you were a minority-dominated school, which we had some that white kids wanted to go to, white kids got preference. The consistent value embedded in that is, we said there's clear academic value to creating a diverse environment, especially think back to the polyglot nature of Seattle. So it is diversity, it's not desegregation. So that was our method to figure out who got those 50 seats at Montlake Elementary. Once all the minority kids were in, then it was just the remaining white kids by distance from the school. Okay. At high school, we very much wanted an open market. You all know, having attended high school, that your parents would go a long way to get you to high school they wanted. There's a long history of people doing long travel time. So we didn't want to have a neighborhood line on a map. It was purely open choice. And there, the first tiebreaker was sibling. We did not have a neighborhood tiebreaker, so the second tiebreaker was diversity, and then a distance tiebreaker. So if it's a minority-dominated school, the siblings of any existing student got in first, and then all the white kids got in next. And then there'd be a distance tiebreaker for all the kids that didn't get that tiebreaker, that didn't get the diversity tiebreaker. And that the reverse would be true for white-dominated schools. Okay, so here's what happened. There's Seattle. Here's our 10 high schools. Okay, some of them were popular, some of them weren't. If they didn't fill up, anybody who applied got in, regardless of race, regardless of location, regardless of everything. If there was a seat available, you got it. There were There was one high school that was minority dominated that white kids wanted to go to. And there was 4 schools that were white dominated that minorities wanted to go to. Okay, here are the 4 white schools. Okay. This is Garfield, that's Ballard, that's Roosevelt, that's Nathan Hale. Call it 300 kids in that entering freshman class. And any kid that has a sibling got in, then it went to diversity tiebreaker. So every minority kid that applied, in some cases small numbers, but they got in. And then there'd be a distance tiebreaker for the white kids. This is Franklin High School, very popular high school. Probably our second most popular high school at the time, minority dominated. We could draw a circle around it for minority students because every white kid got in based on the diversity tiebreaker. Okay. So this is something close to real data. This is about that. And as you see, we had pretty good coverage. If you were a white parent, you had choices of schools that you could absolutely get into, with one exception. That little spot right there. Look at it. All of these circles, and none of them cover that little slice of geography. So if you were a white family with an entering high school, you couldn't go to any of those 4 schools. You could have gone here, you could go any of those or way up there. But you basically have to drive by 2 or 3 other schools to get your kid to a school. That's true. And that's a burden and that's a problem. Well, just to add to my personal pain here, I lived right here. So I knew those people personally. They went to grade school with my parents, with my daughter, right? I knew them. That also is the richest, whitest, most Republican part of Seattle, called Magnolia. So they sued. And the argument was, were it not for the diversity tiebreaker, we would have gotten in. Now me, the technician in me says, well, no, you're presuming what the student assignment algorithm would have been if we had removed the diversity tiebreaker. You know, it is the job of a school district, if there's 300 seats and 400 kids want them, you're gonna tick off at least 100 people. You're gonna say no to 100 people, and you just have to accept that that's your, because you can't manufacture new seats at those schools. Okay, so they were sued, and Thiru's going to take it from there.
You know, when this litigation commenced, years before it went to the Supreme Court, Seattle's policy was likely on very strong, very sound constitutional footing. Not only had federal courts and the U.S. Supreme Court endorsed policies and programs that were race conscious, that took account of race in order to further integration objectives for decades. For decades, federal courts had ordered school districts to do the kinds of things that Joe and Seattle were voluntarily doing. They were adopting a program that was in many ways similar to the approaches that had been directed by federal courts to achieve the promise of Brown. It also, from a political perspective, I think I've always said that part of the genius of it was that it married philosophies on different parts of the political spectrum. Between school choice and diversity, you had the kinds of ideas that back then were very much, you know, polar opposites on a political spectrum, and you had them all in one place. So it's almost difficult to find folks to challenge it. And indeed,
And just to reinforce your point, I mean, my talking point, my little bumper sticker was, we're using Republican techniques to solve Democratic problems.
It was so popular, I mean, that they actually had difficulty finding parents to be a part of parents involved in Seattle schools, PICS, the organization that brought the suit. But eventually they did. And
It was that little space.
And the residents of Magnolia brought the suit. they lost in the district court. They lost in the Court of Appeals. And those federal judges at the district court and Court of Appeals level cited decades of precedent that said this is certainly acceptable. In fact, we used to force you to do what they are voluntarily doing. But by the time it went to the Supreme Court, something dramatic had changed. Justice Alito and Chief Justice Roberts arrived on the court in 2006, October term 2006, and they were now two new justices on the Supreme Court. And the swing vote for issues like this, which had previously been held by Justice O'Connor, by the way, the justice who had written the majority opinion in the Michigan affirmative action cases, which had upheld the use of race in college and law school admissions with certain caveats, had now been replaced by Justice Kennedy, who was in dissent in the Michigan cases and was now the controlling vote. The folks who brought this litigation certainly would not have known that when they started, but by 2006, 2007, the court was very different. Indeed, the year that I clerked was one of the most controversial in history. There were some 25 5-4 decisions, more than nearly any other term in history. 23 of those, the former liberal flank that had enjoyed the majority with Justice O'Connor found themselves in dissent. Parents involved in Seattle schools and the companion case from Louisville, Kentucky was likely the most controversial. I think even back then, Justice Breyer might have said, you're probably going to be talking about this in 18 years. It was the last opinion delivered by the court. It was, for Justice Breyer, an important decision for the nation. Linda Greenhouse, the New York Times reporter who covered this case, it was the front page of the New York Times with an across the banner headline, said that those in the courtroom had never seen Justice Breyer speak with such emotion. He was the son of a schoolhouse lawyer. His father was the attorney for the San Francisco School Board, and he himself had gone to Lowell High School, a public school that was vital for his own story. So it was important to him. And what happened, unfortunately, in this case, unfortunately from my perspective and many others, was that the weight of precedent that had delivered decisions exactly opposite to this for quite literally decades, which we talked about earlier, was reversed on a dime. From the bench, Justice Breyer delivered a line that is not included in the opinion. Linda Greenhouse caught it. He said from the bench, rare in the history of the law has so much been undone so quickly by so few. That was the words he said from the bench as he delivered the 23rd 5-4 dissent of that term. The Chief Justice wrote the majority opinion, and Chief Justice Roberts, in what Justice Stevens described as sloganeering, said, if you want to live in a colorblind society, you have to be colorblind. That is our guiding principle. That is what the Equal Protection Clause says. You cannot take account of race, period. That violates the Equal Protection Clause. Justice Kennedy had a more nuanced perspective. Justice Kennedy, who cast the decisive vote in this 5-4 decision, said, I actually agree that diversity in schools is a compelling state interest. Early in law school, you learn that if you have something that is race conscious, that is subject to the strictest level of scrutiny, you need to satisfy two things. One, that you are trying to achieve a compelling state interest, and two, that the approach that you are taking is narrowly tailored. Justice Kennedy said, I agree that it's a compelling state interest. I just don't think this approach is narrowly tailored. Despite the nuance and sophistication of the approach that Seattle and Louisville, Kentucky, and so many other jurisdictions were taking, Justice Kennedy was convinced that there was other approaches. You could build a new schoolhouse, which of course happens every 25 or 30 years. You could redraw lines and secretly account for the race demographics of those neighborhoods and result in this diversity without having to be so overt about it.
Spoken by someone who's never run a school system.
That was Justice Kennedy's view, and it became the law of the land. Justice Breyer wrote the longest opinion of any, majority or dissent, in this case, some 77 pages. It is the only opinion that Justice Breyer ends without the typical courtesy that marked so many of his opinions. He's a professor here again at Harvard, and he's professorial. He's even-handed, he's temperate, and in virtually every dissent that he ever wrote, he ends the same way. He says, for these reasons, I respectfully dissent. I respectfully dissent for the reasons set forth above in this decision. It is the only opinion I'm aware of where he omits the word respectfully. The last two lines of the opinion are, this is a nation I fear that this court and the nation will come to regret. I must dissent. He was fearful of the consequences of this decision, that the work that had been done over the course of decades was certainly had slowed. Again, the apex of integration in this country was 1988, was now going to face another setback, perhaps comparable only to Milliken versus Bradley, when the solution to the problem of white flight was struck down by the Supreme Court over Justice Marshall's dissent. There are a couple of aspects of Justice Breyer's dissent that I want to share with you that were really remarkable in commenting on the history of law that he had inherited. The first was this distinction between de jure segregation and de facto segregation, segregation by law and segregation as a matter of fact. Segregation by law is the law says you can't go to a particular school. Segregation by fact is you live in a neighborhood which just so happens to assign you to a school. You're not barred from going to another school, but you have to move into that district. And for years, the Supreme Court had set up different rules for de jure segregation and de facto segregation. And Justice Breyer said it's a little bit more complicated than that. Many of these jurisdictions had features of de jure segregation, which they avoided having a pronouncement by a court because they voluntarily agreed to desegregate their schools. So there's no court opinion in Seattle that said this is a jurisdiction that had a history of de jure segregation, but of course they did. There just isn't a court opinion that said, in light of the fact that you have de jure segregation, we can force kids to go to different schools through busing. Seattle was considered a de facto segregation example, and that belied the complexity of the history that marked not just Seattle, but the country. The second point he wanted to make was about the importance and value of dicta. Dicta is those pronouncements in a decision that are actually not essential to the verdict of the court. You decide that the case can't go forward because no one has standing, so we can kick out the case for that reason, but we're going to share with you some commentary on what this case might have resulted in so that we as the Supreme Court can provide guidance to the lower courts, because they still have to wrestle with this even if we have to kick this decision on standing grounds. That dicta is not binding on lower courts, but it was meant to be persuasive. And Justice Breyer highlighted this and the importance of dicta in example after another about why not only were the firm pronouncements of the Supreme Court clear as to why Seattle and Louisville, Kentucky could do what they had done, but there was all sorts of examples, including from people like Chief Justice Rehnquist, who said, there is perhaps a question whether we can order you to do it, but the question of whether you can do it by choice, that is very clear. Even Chief Justice Rehnquist in dicta had said such things, but that, of course, was ignored as well. And finally, there was this distinction that Justice Breyer wanted to draw about how you apply strict scrutiny. If you go to law school, you'll learn that if you're going to discriminate on the basis of hair color, you only have to survive rational basis review. As long as there's a rational basis for why we treat one person's eye color or hair color different than another, the government can do it. If you're going to discriminate on the basis of gender, you're subject to intermediate scrutiny. There has to be a stronger reason and a stronger proximity between the solution and the problem. If you are going to discriminate on the basis of race, if you are going to be race conscious in your policy, whether it's with businesses or school districts or student assignments, you have to survive strict scrutiny. Strict scrutiny is, as one justice said, almost nearly always fatal in fact. It requires you to prove a compelling state interest and that it is narrowly tailored. Very few decisions have survived that level of scrutiny. And Justice Breyer said that level of scrutiny makes all the sense in the world when you are talking about a program that seeks to divide people by race. A law that says Black people have to do one thing and white people have to do another, that certainly should be subject to the strictest level of scrutiny. But when the objective is to bring people of different races together, and that's why we are counting of race, surely that requires a different kind of scrutiny. For after all, strict scrutiny rooted in the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution is found in amendments that came from the days after the Civil War. That is what we were trying to achieve. We were trying to bring people together. And if a policy of a school district has that as its obvious objective, then surely we don't have to apply the same level of scrutiny. Nevertheless, Justice Breyer was writing in dissent. And the law of the land, unfortunately, is that school systems cannot take account of race. And all the things that he feared came to pass. I'm just going to end by reading his final words in the decision. He retired some 18 years ago. A few years ago, 3 years ago, some 15 years after the decision had been rendered. And what he said was this: finally, what of the hope and promise of Brown? For much of this nation's history, the races remained divided. It was not long ago that people of different races drank from separate fountains, rode on separate buses, and studied in separate schools. In this court's finest hour, Brown versus Board of Education challenged this history and helped to change it. For Brown held out a promise. It was a promise embodied in 3 amendments designed to make citizens of slaves. It was the promise of true racial equality, not as a matter of fine words on paper, but as a matter of everyday life in the nation's cities and schools. It was about the nature of a democracy that must work for all Americans. It sought one law, one nation, one people, not simply as a matter of legal principle, but in terms of how we actually live. The last century has witnessed great strides toward racial equality, but we have not yet realized the promise of Brown. The court's decision, I fear, would break that promise. This is a decision that the court and the nation will come to regret. I must dissent. Unfortunately, Justice Breyer's fears have come to pass. I told you that in 1988 was the height of integration in America's schools. When Justice Breyer wrote this opinion in 2007, he reported that schools were more segregated in 2007 than at any point in history since 1968. It had gotten worse every year since 1988. Here we sit here today, some 18 years after he wrote those fateful words, and things are even worse than they were in 2007. Today's schools are more segregated than any point since 1968. The height of integration in America was 1988. The fact that we have to say that in 2025 is something that I am confident would make Justice Marshall turn over in his grave, and must be, I would expect, a source of great disappointment for Justice Breyer. But that is the reality, despite the Herculean, valiant, noble efforts of people like Joe and superintendents all around the country that appreciated the importance of diversity and wanted to see that delivered as part of the promise of Brown.
Thank you both. I wonder if I can ask just one factual question before opening it up. So, what was the demographic shift that happened once the choice program went into place? So, one of the things you mentioned was that the schools in the North were sort of depopulated to some extent. It sounded like from students in the South who no longer wanted to go. So it sounded like those schools may have ended up being more white and less diverse than they were before, and the reverse may even also have been true in the South. But I don't know if...
No, both of those would be true. Both of those would be true. I mean, schools started reflecting their neighborhoods. I mean, there is truth to that. But let me just...
So I guess the question is, did it affect diversity in the way you had hoped or expected?
We knew the kids of color that were being bused in the North End were going to go back to to neighborhood schools that were heavily kids of color, but they're going to be there by choice. So I wanted to,
I'll get it back.
yeah, okay. So that is true. But I'll say a couple things. One, okay, thank you. Each one of these colors is a middle school catchment area. This is Madison, this is Denny, okay? But then there's these intermediate lines in there. That's a elementary school catchment area. Okay, so here is Schmitz Park. Okay, and the rule was you can choose any school you want in the district. And if you chose your neighborhood school, you got in first. If you chose within this region, you got busing to any one of these schools. Okay, the kids of color that before we were mandatorily assigning north long bus rides, we continued to offer that busing to the north end. Quickly, they chose away from that, right? But it was interesting, a big distinction between choice patterns between white parents and kids of color, families of color. The white families in the north generally pick their neighborhood school, their immediate neighborhood school. Kids of color in the south shopped. They went, we called it swirl. They swirled within their region, they shopped. They had never been given the opportunity to shop. They were mandatorily assigned. So they found schools that made sense for their kid in that way. The goal here wasn't desegregation. We knew that. We were conscious of that. So did it increase first choice percentage? Yeah, about 95% of kids were getting their first choice. Very high. We also saw, interesting, that the percentage of, in school district speak, you can measure market share. What percentage of local kids choose your schools? And you'd measure that by birth to kindergarten, right? 1 year, how many kids are born? 5 years later, how many show up in kindergarten? In the 3 years after this, that market share increased 8 percentage points. People were coming back to Seattle schools because of these dynamics.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you both so much. So I'm from this area. I went to.
I could tell by your face.
Yeah.
You were nodding when I said Ballard.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So I actually I did K through 12 in Tacoma Public Schools,
Okay.
but I lived in Seattle for a period.
Okay.
And I had a lot of friends in Seattle who, when that kind of rush to high schools was happening.
Yeah.
The second they didn't get their neighborhood school, they immediately went to private schools. And I feel like, I don't know how unique Seattle is with this, but there are so many private schools. I'm curious what the public school flight looked like.
Well, as I just said, there was a net inflow in the Seattle public schools from private schools as a result of this. Because in the past, I think maybe 70% of parents were getting their first choice school. We've moved it to 95%. So people were getting, you always worry about the last 5%. That's who sues you.
Mhm.
Is that little sliver of Magnolia is who sues you. But broadly, it was very popular because people were getting their first, or if not their first, their second choice. So I would disagree with your point that if you didn't get your first choice, you went to private schools, because there were multiple choices and people would rank order their choices. You wouldn't just put in one choice, you put in multiple choices. So no, I think the impact was we clearly increased enrollment, definitely at the elementary level, and likewise at the high school level, less so in the middle school. So this was a market share claim. I mean, I had several friends that were private school principals. They weren't happy about it because they were seeing attrition out.
And that first and second choice piece, I think, is really important. In a lot of jurisdictions, it's not just one great school, it's a handful. And so for those folks who were not in the neighborhood where they could go to that great school, private school was an option for those who could afford it. But if you actually now can access, because of school choice, a couple of those great schools, now you can avoid the price of private schools. If you get into that second or third one, that would suddenly become an option.
So just to make that point real for a second, something I'm very proud of as superintendent, the school district that I inherited, there were only 3 popular high schools, right? Franklin, Garfield, and Roosevelt. The year I was appointed superintendent, 80% of the first choices went to those 3 schools. The other 7 schools got 20% of the choices. So we were ticking off lots of people, right? And one of the things I really committed to, this isn't just a choice problem, this is a quality problem, because parents are telling you, and you can't have 3 out of your 10 high schools be considered good. And so I always considered this graphic a success story, right? Because Franklin continued to be good, so we went from 3 schools to 5 schools. Another year later, 1 more, that school became very popular. So we went from 3 to 6 schools that were oversubscribing. But yeah, when you have 80%, I think the point you made would have been true before this, and less so because of this.
Kind of building off of that point, but I guess more in a current context, with many states turning towards private school vouchers and that being more of a reality, I guess in the context of this conversation, first off, where do we go from here in terms of just integrating our schools, and also with greater voucher systems that are popping up all over the country, how do we also account for that in terms of creating diversity within our schools? And also, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah. I mean, you have some opinions in this area, I'm sure, Paul, because PEPG certainly follows this what I call the unbundling of education that's going on. That is absolutely true, and I think that is an avoidance of the issues of diversity and desegregation. It's really about individualization of education. So the answer to your question, where we go from here, I'm not convinced that it's still an objective. I mean, sadly, but true. I mean, I don't know if you have.
Thiru, what do you think?
Yeah.
Is increasing choice going to make things even worse going forward?
I am a huge advocate of school choice. I think it is really important to create a sort of marketplace where the schools have an incentive to market themselves in a way that captures, share. I think the reality is, as you expand that market to public versus private, and suddenly because of vouchers and things like that, it becomes a little bit more of a wide choice. The competition is stiffer. And I think especially in jurisdictions that have schools that struggle, there's a lot of them, unfortunately. The phenomenon that Joe was just referencing is very true. There's a very small number of good public schools and then a long list of bad ones. If I had one area to focus on, it would be to increase the number of those good schools, because not only will a school choice plan then give folks in neighborhoods that typically feed into one of the bad schools to have a chance to go to a school that isn't just the top 3, but also you'll have a lot of folks that say $30,000 a year for a private school. Gosh, I'd rather just go to that other school, which, Joel Klein had done this in New York City, where, a lot of folks knew about Bronx Science and Stuyvesant, and, there were sort of 4 great public schools. And one of the goals was to create 4 more. In Baltimore City, there's City, Poly, Baltimore School for the Arts, and Western. Those 4 schools are the schools, and if your kids don't get into those schools, the precipitous drop-off is so significant that you go to private schools. I think the one area that we could focus on is finding ways to quite literally add schools to that list, finding ways to take some of those schools that are maybe on the brink, flow them resources, give them identities, give them, connections to Johns Hopkins, or, whatever it is that might convert them into as popular as the Bronx Science and Stuyvesant's as the cities and Polis.
Actually, quick follow-up to that.
Yeah.
and this is more of a political question. So the folks or the constituents or the advocacy groups that tend to support more proactive integration policies also tend to be those who oppose the development of more charter schools that might be of higher quality and might be more attractive to a broad cross-section. I think of Success Academy in New York. I mean, they're considered to be sort of the enemy of the left, anyway, if you will, if this is a left-right issue. Any sort of
I don't
sense?
know if that's the case anymore, though.
Well, they had a specific strategy to locate schools in, wider, more.
But if you look at, we were just talking about this last week at our meeting. If you look at the success of the charter schools in, say, Southeast DC, Harlem, some of the minority communities where people are choosing to go to segregated schools. Absolutely. I mean, you go through Southeast DC, you go through Anacostia, and the success of the charter movement there is and I think this is your.
I guess my point is the political establishment is not. They're on the other side of that.
Well, there's a talking point to that, but I do think there is a constituency, certainly within the Black community, maybe less with other ethnic groups, but there are some very strong Black dominated charter
The
schools.
largest ethnic group in charter schools today is Hispanic.
Yeah. Okay. I did not know that.
I mean, I take your point, and I think it's a really important observation. I think that's one of the reasons why lots of Democrats have actually started moving away from being so anti-charter schools.
Yeah.
And I'll just take.
I've seen the exact opposite happening. That 15, 20 years ago, there was this grand compromise.
Yeah.
Bill Clinton and Barack
Yeah.
Obama.
Yeah.
And, all,
Sure.
and now you can't find people willing to sit together.
That is fascinating. I mean, in Baltimore, there has been a real commitment to the rise of charter schools, which I think has been overall positive. And one of the things that they've done, because one of the objections is that sort of the waiting for Superman, language was there's a whole bunch of people, and if you don't get in, you're out. And in Baltimore City, one of the very popular things is charter schools, which guarantee admission to the folks that are there, and then anybody else gets to sort of, apply and get in. And that has become very popular. I think there are some compromises that need to be made. And I'm disappointed to hear that.
Yeah, because you must have a different fact pattern than I have, because I live in DC. Big charter community, one of the bluest of blue cities in America. Charters are very popular there. There is no war about the charter schools in DC. Now, maybe
I do think that's a little sui generis, though.
Yeah, it might be.
New Orleans might be another sui generis.
Well, sure, yes.
Yeah, where there's a big concentration, but
In the spirit of where we can
Boston,
go
not
from
so
here.
much.
Yeah.
I don't know this.
Yeah.
I'd be really interested to know. So when I talk about this, I often note that in Baltimore City, one of the things that allowed this convergence was a deal that was brokered between the teachers union and the schools, where the compromise was that charter schools still needed to use union teachers. And so there was a constraint put on charter schools, which previously was considered one of the great blessings of charter schools.
Yeah, right.
They didn't have to. So that obstacle, that sort of pitted political forces, was kind of relaxed. And then all of a sudden, it was a little bit easier to be pro-charter schools. I don't know if that's sui generis.
Right. So, Jim, I want to connect to your question, because I, from my fact pattern, I do think this unbundling phenomenon, the ESAs, the vouchers, however you want to call it, I think that will skew white. I think that'll skew more middle class and white, and will increase segregation, racial isolation. Again, you know the data probably better than I on this, but that's certainly where I would go. Whereas charters, I stand by. There's a lot of great examples of 100% non-white charter schools out there.
We have somebody else had
Hi, I'm Diego. I'm from Colombia. Actually, one of the reasons that I'm here in Harvard is because we want to implement for the first time public choice in Colombia.
Yeah.
And right now we have a bill in the Congress. However, the problem we have there is, for example, in the capital, that is Bogota, is that most of the poor kids go to public schools that are in the south, and more of the rich kids go to the north, that is the private schools. So we want to put some of these poor kids to go to the north, to go to private schools through the voucher program. But my question is, based on your experience, do you think that if we put these poor kids in the north, in that private schools, through the time they're going to come back again to the south, even if there are worse schools?
Yeah, well, I would make a couple of comments. One, you have an exemplar right down the road from you in Chile, who's, and I don't know if you know Emiliana Vegas at the ed school. She's studied both countries quite a bit, and so you have an ally in Emiliana. That being said, I'm just a believer that when a parent chooses a school for their kid, it changes the relationship between that family and that school. I do believe there's a value in choice. Now, what I saw in Seattle is there were schools that by any researcher or my academic team would view the schools as not being good schools. There were still parents that chose them, and were happy at that school. And it could be, I'm a Samoan family and they have the only Samoan high school teacher in the whole district. I want to be at that school. It could be as simple as that. It could be something specifically about the program there. So I don't think people try to paint this brush of there's bad schools and there's good schools and, a little bit of a 0-1 phenomenon. And the reality is, parent choice and parent preferences for schools is idiosyncratic, and you don't know till they actually choose. So I wouldn't be presumptuous to try and answer your question without knowing which family and which community and all that sort of stuff. But I do think the power of choices will be hugely revealing to you. I mean, just like the observation, this wasn't a Joseph observation. This is what the data said, that white families chose the neighborhood schools, minority families did the swirl and shopped within the region. That was an experienced fact. That was not a speculation.
So I would make one comment, and that is just to pass on Alberto Carvalho's experience. He was in Miami, where the charter movement was very strong, and the private schools were very significant competition. And now he's in Los Angeles, and there's a big
As superintendent in both places.
big charter school sector there. And he says, choice is a reality. It's coming. There's a demand for it. But you got to ride the wave.
Yeah.
So what he always did was, I'm going to give you choice within the public sector. And I'm going to make every school the best school I can. So he really has never tried to fight choice. He has tried to say, I'm going to augment choice and I'm going to create some great schools. So very much like what he was saying.
Yeah. It's an interesting phenomenon. Now,
By the way, he's been very successful.
Yeah, very successful.
Places. Yeah.
Yeah.
So to me, that's the reality that you have to, this is going to be the next step forward. I can't imagine big city school systems avoiding creating what's now called portfolio districts, where you try to magnify the variety of schools and give families.
And if I can just add one thing, the sort of phenomenon of self-segregation by charter schools, it's interesting. Even there, you have minority families choosing a superior charter school, even though it is self-segregation, than what they believe would be the alternative. They find, Frederick Elementary to be a superior charter school option, even though it is predominantly Black, than the pure public
Which
option.
is the DC experience.
Correct.
Absolutely.
And similarly, there are more interesting options within the portfolio that are needed to recruit more affluent parents. The most popular charter school in Baltimore where more affluent families send their kids. It is predominantly minority still, is a school that is a language immersion program. And it has Spanish, Chinese, Arabic, Russian, and French. And it draws large immigrant families that are first native French speakers or native Arabic speakers, as well as a number of affluent families that are like, it's elementary school. My best hope for my kid learning French is to put him in a school like this. And so you have to use different recruiting tactics and identities to get even different demographics to think about those choices.
And by the way, one quick thing, and I know we're out of time here, but in the charter sector, not in every state, but a place like Massachusetts, they can be regional. They can be, chartered as a regional school, so they can draw from multiple districts in a way that an in-district school can't, which creates a broader opportunity for diversity.
There's an interesting fact pattern in Seattle because there's, it's not as choice market based as in my era, but some of these market choice dynamics still are in the district. We didn't have charter schools to compete against, but I kind of felt we were creating somewhat of a charter district. And charters came to Washington State and they were a suburban phenomenon. They didn't try to compete in the city. And it's sort of a ring of charters around the city, even today.
All right, I think we're done. Thank you both very much.